Hi. Hi. I had to turn the other button on too. This is Mike Gant, and this podcast is called Scriptural Christianity, and I'm video recording it on Periscope in order to load it up to YouTube. That's the, what do you call it, landscape view, and this is the portrait view. I don't know which is better, but I'll leave it this way for the time being. Today I want to talk about how misfits can navigate the world. Last week I talked about misfits, meaning that we don't fit into the world because we realize that we've gone away from God, that we haven't done right in life, and so we're accepting His offer of forgiveness through Jesus Christ in order to return to Him and live the way He originally designed us to live. And as a result of that, we are not going in the same direction we were going in before. In fact, we find ourselves going contrary to the general direction of the world. And for the few weeks before that, I think I talked about, the world and spiritual forces. And there's a lot of temptation in the world to do evil. So if someone wants to do wrong, they get a lot of help. And since I talked about misfits last week, I want to talk about how we navigate in this world. How do we get along? How do we find our way? And there was an article that I read this week that described an individual and a negative experience he had had. And I wanted to talk about it in this teaching today. So I don't know exactly how long this will take. I need to stay under 30 minutes. So I'll just do the best I can to try to manage the time. Now, first thing I'm going to do is read this article to you. I'll have the links to it in the blog post. But in order to talk about it, I think I just want to read it. So here's the title: Devoted Christian Chris Rouston. It could be Rouston. It's spelled Rouston. I'm going to say Rouston, but I don't know if that's right or not. It says he has been fired from his job of 13 years because he shared his faith with his coworkers. And then it says, please read and share on how to help. Now, this story, apparently, I wanted to make sure that it was a legitimate story, so I did a quick Google search on the key words, and apparently, there's a number of articles written about it. So I take it's a solid story. But I have not researched all those articles, and I really don't want to write about this individual, Chris Rouston, at all. I'm going to use the story to make a point, but I'm not trying to offer opinions on him and what he should or shouldn't do or should or shouldn't have done. I'm almost going to take this story as if it's a parable, or as if it's a fictionalized story that's put together to make a point. Whenever you get a news story like this, you're never quite sure if you've got the whole story or not. So I say all this because I want your focus to be on how I'm using it as an example for you and me, and not trying to formulate an opinion or pass judgment on this individual. Okay, so we're just going to take the story as written, as if it were written just as an example. It says here, a dedicated Christian steel worker in Ohio has been fired after he shared his faith in the faith-based movie Audacity with two lesbian co-workers, leaving him, his wife, and his two kids without any income. And by the way, I've got a link to the movie. You can watch the movie for free on YouTube, and I've got a link to the movie and to the trailer in the blog post as well. The employment of precision strip metal processing worker Chris, well, now here it says Routson instead of Rouston, so I don't know. Anyway, he worked on the floor of Precision Strips plant in Middletown, Ohio for the last 13 years, came to an abrupt end on August 27th when he was terminated without severance pay or unemployment because his lesbian co-workers were uncomfortable with how he indiscriminately shared his faith with them. Routson explained in an interview with the Christian Post that since he became a Christian about 4 years ago, he has made a custom of sharing his love for Jesus with all of his co-workers, no matter who they are. But after Precision Strip hired a lesbian worker about a year ago, Routson knew that sooner or later the act of sharing his faith would come into question. Upon the hiring of the lesbian woman, Routson didn't immediately approach the woman to talk about his faith and prayed that God would eventually present him with the perfect opportunity to do so. As the faith-based film Audacity was released this year to help show that many Christians love homosexual individuals despite not agreeing with their life choices, Routson felt compelled to share the Ray Comfort-produced film with his lesbian co-worker. One Saturday, when he was at home, Routson sent a link of the film to his lesbian co-worker via Facebook. The week this movie came out, I shared it with her on her personal messages, and she was already my friend on Facebook, so it wasn't like I forced it on her at all, Routson said. I just said, hey, check this out. The following Monday, Routson came to work and noticed other workers gathered around the lesbian co-worker. Routson was told that she was uncomfortable being around him because of the Facebook message, and he was instructed to visit his manager's office. They said, someone said you didn't make them feel comfortable. I said, I sent out a video to share the gospel just because it talks about homosexuality. They said, you can't do that. You can't do that, explained Routson. So I said, I was just trying to share my faith with her, and it doesn't matter that I didn't have a chance to work with her. I can share a link on Facebook on my own time, right? They're like, no, you can't do that. You can't be sharing with people on Facebook because they work here. Or maybe they were saying, you can't be sharing with people on Facebook because they work here. I'm not sure. They were saying I can't do that, but I have never seen anything that says I couldn't, Routson asserted. A day after being called into the office, Routson said that another lesbian co-worker was hired to work in the facility. Just as he had shared his faith with all of his other co-workers, Routson felt compelled to share his faith with the new lesbian co-worker. I apologize. I should have thought of a better way to deal with the subject matter. So, the new girl comes in, and it was like any other new person. We were talking about the gospel, and I shared my faith with her, and at the same time shared the Audacity movie with her, Routson said. I said, you got to check out Audacity. At that point, some of the guys, some of my enemies that are there, come around her and talked her into going up front to try and get me fired, and that is what happened. Routson was again told to go to the manager's office, where he was told to go home for the day. The next morning, Routson was called on the phone and told to come in a few hours later than normal. Upon his arrival at the facility on August 27th, Routson was told that his employment was being terminated because he made his coworkers feel uncomfortable. Officials from Precision Strip declined to comment on Routson's termination when contacted by a Christian Post reporter. Since his termination, Routson has acquired the representation of the Ohio-based Christian Law Association. Quote, if you are put in a situation where you're going to be fired or you're going to be persecuted for your faith, never give in to the fear of man, always fear the Lord, Routson said. No matter what happens, trust the outcome to God rather than trying to think about how we can stop it from happening. End quote. Routson, who earned about $60,000 per year working at Precision Strip, is still in search of employment and has set up a GoFundMe fundraising page to help his family get by while he remains unemployed. On top of providing for his two children, Routson also provides for his wife, Becca, who has medical issues that require medication costing $350 per month. Thus far, $4,125 has been donated by 102 different donors. So there's the story, and it's a somewhat familiar story in that we've heard these kinds of stories in the last year. The story of Melissa and Aaron Klein, who owned a bakery in, I can't remember exactly where their bakery was, but they were asked to bake a cake for a unconventional, let's say, wedding, and they declined, and then I think it was the state of Oregon, so maybe they're near Portland. at any rate, they were investigated by the government, fined $135,000. They lost their storefront. They gave that up, and I think she tries to continue her business working out of her home, working out of her kitchen, but they lost the retail operation, and they're being helped by some, I think it's Alliance Defending Freedom is the Christian organization that's helping them. Fortunately, there are a number of these different Christian legal organizations that will help you. That's one of them. Another is the American Center for Law and Justice, and then here's this Christian Law Association, which is based in Ohio. There's the American Center for Law and Justice with Jay Sekulow. So yeah, we've heard that story. There was a baker in Denver, went through a similar thing to the Kleins. There is Baronelle Stutzman, who I think is in the state of Washington. She's a florist. She's a grandmother. She got in trouble for not wanting to do, one of these unconventional weddings. So this story is a little bit, is following that pattern. But I remember when these other stories came up, I feel differently about this story than I do the other stories that came up, because it seems to me that the other stories that came up were sort of early in this new environment in which we find ourselves, where, the whole sweep of human history has viewed marriage one way, and now, up until even just a few years ago, and now all of a sudden everything's changed, and all of a sudden we've got to be on board with this new way of looking at marriage that no one in human history has ever looked at this way before. Or at least no nation, no significant number of people have ever looked this way before. And now we're just supposed to all believe that anybody that believes the way humanity's always believed is just rooted in ignorance and superstition and bigotry and hatred. And so these people, I think, were sort of blindsided by that. By what happened to them. And I think even in the states where this happened, this new kind of marriage was not even legalized, was not the law at the time. But now that this has all happened, especially since the Supreme Court decision, Obergefell versus Hodges, has come down, these things are no longer a surprise, and they're going to happen more and more often. Now, in this particular case, it wasn't a unconventional wedding, but rather someone sharing their faith. And in this movie, that's what happens. A believer comes into contact with people who believe that this is a good thing. He shares his faith, and it's produced by Ray Comfort. And if you know Ray Comfort, he's an Australian evangelist. I don't know a lot about him, but I've seen videos of him, and I've seen one or two of his movies. And he's very aggressive with his evangelism. He does street evangelism, and he goes right up to, all sorts of people and challenges them. And he sometimes works with Kirk Cameron, who used to do the show Family Ties. I guess that was the name of it. And anyway, they're very forthright. And so I think this guy, Chris Routson, is, he's just doing what Ray Comfort and others have told him to do, which is you need to share your faith. In fact, the theme song, I think, or the theme song of the movie, I think, was I Can't Be Silent, or something to that effect. It's a good song. But I don't think that this guy would have done this, had it not been for Ray Comfort and people like Ray Comfort pushing him. This is what you need to do. Now, I'll get back to that in a minute. I've gotten a little ahead of myself. Let me back up and go back to these other examples. When these other things happened, I saw these people as being blindsided. They didn't see this was coming. And so I was and I remain extremely sympathetic to them. And so I don't want anything I'm saying to be negative toward them. And I'm not negative toward this guy either, but I do have a little bit different feeling about it, which I'll explain in a minute. But when these things happen to these other people, I thought to myself, this is not a sustainable model. This model of, okay, Christians continue being Christians like they used to, but now they're going to get in trouble for it, and they're going to lose their job, and they're going to, lose their business, and then we're going to start a fundraising operation, and some Christian legal organization is going to come in, and either through pro bono work or a combination of pro bono and fundraising operation, they're going to get the funding to do this. I thought this is going to break down very, very quickly, because there are going to be a lot of these kind of cases, lots of them. And there aren't enough people. I mean, if every Christian, you just would run through all the money of all the Christians if this was the way you tried to respond to all of them. It's not a sustainable model. And I don't even know how well it's going to work for people like Barronelle Stutzman and Aaron and Melissa Klein. Because when you go through things like that, I mean, yeah, the money helps, but it doesn't make up for everything. And you lose a lot that can't be quantified or can't be put in monetary terms. Now, to this thing, I look at this situation and I think, this guy means well, so I really can't blame him. I'm sympathetic toward him. But I look at it's somebody like Ray Comfort that's pushing him to go and share his faith. So there's the question. Should he have been sharing his faith in that environment? Now, I don't think he should have been, but my reason for thinking that is not what the world will give you. The world will say, well, that's a workplace you shouldn't be sharing in a workplace, or, that's private, you should not be, it's really not any of those kinds of things, because what they want is they want to create a world in which God is completely shut out. That's what they're after. And I'm not interested in supporting that point of view. The reason that I think that he should not have shared was that it wasn't going to produce any fruit. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7 and verse 6, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not cast your pearls before swine, lest they turn and tear you to pieces. And that's what's going on here. I mean, he's sharing with people who just have no interest whatsoever. I mean, their minds are completely closed. They're reacting by instinct. They're not even thinking through anything that he's saying. And so there's no benefit. There's no benefit to being to sharing those things with them. We need to be wise enough to have some sense of whether or not there's going to be some receptivity. And one way to do that is to sort of test out and maybe say smaller things first rather than just going bluntly into, have you seen this movie about how wrong you are? And so this guy has done this. He thinks he's doing what God wants him to do because that's what Ray Comfort does. Well, I don't have any problem with Ray Comfort going out on the street and witnessing to people like he does. I mean, he's very bold. And he goes to the hardest places. I admire him for being willing to do that. But that doesn't mean he should push other people to do that. That doesn't mean other people are called to do that sort of thing. And when you push a guy like this to do this, look what's happened. He can't support his family. And it's not just the income that is lost. It's the health care for his wife, who apparently has special needs. So in here he's left to begging. Well, I'll have to look up the verse, but it's I think it's in the Psalms. David says, I've not seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread. So we're not supposed to be begging. I'll add that verse later. And I look at Ray and I say he really shouldn't be pushing people to do that. But this is the sort of thing that Jesus said in Matthew 23 when he said to the Pharisees, he said, you go about on land and sea. Well, let me get a more exact quotation here. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, that is one convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. So he's saying to the Pharisees, you guys, you're going all over the world trying to make converts, and when you do, you make the person twice as bad as you are, or at least, twice the version. Now, Ray Comfort is doing that. I'll give him credit for this. He's at least been consistent with traditional evangelical doctrine, which is that if you die without saying the sinner's prayer, you're going straight to hell forever and ever and ever. So he believes, because he's been taught, Ray Comfort believes because he's been taught, and therefore he's taught this guy, Chris Rousey. They believe that someone's going to go straight to hell if they don't pray the sinner's prayer first. Well, if that were true, you'd do exactly what Ray Comfort does. In fact, you'd do it all the time. You wouldn't do anything else. You would not spend one moment with a Christian, not one moment. Because while you're talking with a Christian, some non-Christian may die. So, that's what you do 100% of the time, is try to get people to say the sinner's prayer before they die. Even Ray Comfort doesn't do that all the time, because I know he spends time talking to Christians. And I've seen the little thing they did about making the movie, and he had meetings with the actors that are in the movie and stuff like that. So I know he doesn't spend 100% of his time trying to get people to say the sinner's prayer. But he does a lot more of it than most evangelical Christians do. So I salute him for that, because he is at least acting consistent with what he believes. But this is why it's important to know that everyone's going to heaven. That doesn't mean that we don't want people to know about Jesus. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter how we live. It matters a great deal how we live. And we want everyone to know about Jesus. However, if someone doesn't want to hear, you don't have to worry that you're consigning them to hell forever if you don't, tell them about a Christian movie or give them a tract or share the gospel with them. God wants us to be wise as serpents. I like to add this scripture too. Wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Wise as serpents and innocent as doves. When people first become a Christian, there are a lot of churches you'll go to. If you accept Christ, you walk down to the front, and they'll tell you, okay, well, the first things you need to do is you need to go confess Christ. You need to go out and tell people you're a Christian. And, of course, that's a way to get more people to become Christians, and in a lot of cases, it's a way to get more people to come to church. I mean, I hate to be cynical about it, but that's going on in a lot of the cases. And what I would say is that when you become a Christian, the first thing you ought to do is not talk to other people, it's talk to God. Don't go telling everybody else. Talk to God more. Spend time growing up in the faith and becoming mature. I mean, if you want to kill an infant, what do you do? What did people used to do when they wanted to kill infants? And when I mean like a long time ago. Centuries ago. They would expose them. They'd leave the infants out, they'd be exposed to the elements, and they'd die. Why? Because an infant can't handle the exposure. And that's what's happening to a lot of Christians. Satan is pushing people to share their faith before they're ready, before they're mature, before they even have a faith that's really developed. And in that exposure, they die. The world comes against them. They get discouraged. I hope this guy doesn't get discouraged, but it's quite possible that he will and become embittered. So, we've got to remember what it says in Ecclesiastes. There's a time and a season for everything. And it specifically says there's a time to be silent and a time to speak. Now, I'm not trying to discourage you or anyone else from talking about Jesus. I mean, Jesus did say, if you confess me before men, I'll confess you before my Father. If you deny me before men, I'll deny you before my Father. But remember, he was talking to his disciples then, whom he was sending out to bear witness to them. They were apostles. Everybody's not an apostle. In fact, there are no apostles today. Those guys had a once in eternity job function. And when they went around, they told people, when they become Christians, they said, look, basically their message was, start living a good family life. If you're a kid, honor your father and mother. If you're parents, be devoted to each other and teach your children about the Lord. And I've put the scriptures in here. Examples would be Ephesians chapters 5 and 6, Colossians chapter 3 and 4, and 1 Peter chapters 2 and 3. And the apostles are saying, husbands, love your wives. Wives, respect your husbands. Parents, teach your children. Children, honor your parents. I mean, they weren't saying, hey, go out and preach the gospel to every creature. They don't do that. In fact, Paul says, and I've got all these scriptures in there, Paul says, the goal is for you to live a quiet and tranquil life in all godliness and dignity. Now, the apostles knew that these Christians they were teaching, these young Christians, would attract attention, because if you start living for Jesus, walking in the Spirit, acknowledging God at all times and all places, you're going to get noticed sooner or later. I mean, people are going to notice you, and they're going to be asked. And so, in those cases, Peter says, in that very passage I mentioned a moment ago, near the end of it, he says in 1 Peter 3, this is 14 through 16, do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So I just looked at the clock, and we're already 26 and a half minutes, so I didn't manage my time very well. But I've got the scriptures there. I'll add these ones that I didn't have ahead of time. But know this, that there's going to come a time. I mean, specifically look at those scriptures I put in for the book of Esther. When Esther was first made queen, her relative Mordecai, her uncle Mordecai, told her, I can't remember if he was an uncle or cousin or whatever. But anyway, he told her, don't make known that you're a Jew. And she didn't, because he told her not to. And she won the contest to be the new queen, and so she was married by King Ahasuerus. But then later on, this wicked Haman gets King Ahasuerus to issue an edict against the Jews. He's going to kill all the Jews. So Esther is saying, well, if I go in and ask for mercy for the Jews, she goes to Mordecai, if I go in and ask for mercy from the Jews, he's going to find out that I'm a Jew. Is that okay? You told me not to tell him. Mordecai comes back. He says, you need to let him know now that you're a Jew. For how do you know that you have attained royalty for such a time as this? In other words, Mordecai was saying to Esther, God's going to use you to save his people, and don't be afraid. So there was a time for Esther to be silent about her relationship with God, and there was a time for her to be vocal about it. And we need to have that same kind of wisdom too, because we can't have Christians going around losing their jobs all the time. And thank you for listening. Walk with Jesus. He's alive. He's everywhere. He's all the time. Build up your faith by talking with him. And then when the time comes for you to be public with others, you'll have peace and you'll have confidence, because you'll know it's the right time and the right place. God bless you.